Okay, let's unpack this. Today we are attempting, well, a true intellectual feat. We're tackling a massive stack of foundational concepts from the very core of cognitive science.
Yes, specifically, we're diving into everything you'd find under the letter E in a major encyclopedia of the field.
And this isn't just about, reading a glossary. This is about distilling decades of really high-level research into the essential quick-hit insights you need.
Right, to be genuinely well-informed on the inner workings of the mind and also the fundamental philosophical debates about it.
Our mission today is ambitious, to say the least.
It is. We're moving through these concepts alphabetically, defining each term, exploring its core theory or methodology.
You're highlighting exactly why it matters across all these different disciplines. Psychology, neuroscience, AI, philosophy.
Exactly. We are cutting straight to the analytical knowledge, giving you the ultimate shortcut to understanding the bedrock of this entire field.
And what's so fascinating is that even across, 23 different entries? Three dominant overarching themes just sort of emerge.
They really do. The first one is all about how we learn and remember.
Right, from the very first pioneering memory experiments done in a lab, all the way to modern understandings of brain structure and, how we acquire skills.
The second area is maybe the most difficult and dense. It's the complex philosophical battles over the relationship between the physical brain and the conscious mind.
This is where you get these radical ideas like some parts of our consciousness might not even exist.
Or the persistent problem of trying to explain subjective experience using objective physical laws. It's a huge challenge.
And finally, running beneath everything, informing all of it, is the profound influence of evolution.
Absolutely. Evolution shapes everything we study, from our moral intuitions and our ethics to how we define expertise and even how our economic decision-making systems systematically fail to live up to that ideal of pure rationality.
So before we hit the big foundational E's, let's quickly set the neurological stage with a look at developmental dyslexia.
Yeah, this condition provides a great microcosm of just how interconnected our cognitive architecture really is.
It's often thought of as, just a reading disorder, but the neurological roots are so much more complex. What do animal models tell us about the structural side of things?
Well, developmental dyslexia shows us that structural changes in one area can have this kind of cascade effect.
Okay.
Findings from animal models suggest that abnormal cortical development that's in the outer layer of the brain can actually lead to abnormal development in a deeper structure, the thalamus.
Which is like the brain's main relay station for sensory and motor signals, right?
Exactly. And this is significant because it shows a failure of sort of developmental synchronization between these deep and surface brain structures.
So it's not just localized to the language centers, it's actually affecting the sensory input machinery itself.
Precisely. Dyslexia affects both higher-order cognitive tasks and these fundamental sensory perceptual tasks.
So multiple systems are involved.
Multiple modalities, yeah. We see issues with visual motion and even auditory anatomy processing. And the widespread nature of this involvement is key.
Why is that?
Because it limits the developing brain's ability to fully compensate for the deficit, since just too many processing stages are affected at the same time.
But I remember the sources noting that despite this, it's still a relatively delimited learning disorder. It's not a general cognitive breakdown. Why is that distinction so important?
That's a crucial caveat. The relative discreteness of neural connections, even during this rapid developmental period, allows the disorder to remain relatively contained.
So the brain's architecture kind of puts up firewalls.
In a way, yes. It's a specific type of learning difficulty, which suggests that while the developmental failure is complex, the brain's architecture maintains boundaries, preventing a total cognitive collapse. It's a powerful illustration of the brain balancing that widespread connectivity with necessary specialization.
A delimited disorder with deep, widespread roots. That's a great transition point. Let's launch into the core of the ELA files, starting with one of the true titans of experimental memory research. We begin with Hermann Ebbinghaus,
a pioneer who, starting in Berlin way back in 1878, basically laid the groundwork for modern experimental psychology.
Yeah.
And what makes his work so revolutionary isn't just what he discovered, but how he managed to study something as ephemeral as memory with such rigorous objectivity.
He truly invented the methodology for studying it. We talk about him briefly in every Psych 101 class, but it's hard to grasp how sophisticated he really was.
Oh, completely. He was performing the first memory experiments, yes. But he also provided this authoritative review of probability and statistics for his time.
Demonstrated a command of experimental design that honestly rivals modern practice.
And was even conscious enough of the potential pitfalls to discuss things like experimenter bias. His quantitative results have been replicated for decades.
He solved what was the fundamental challenge for early experimental psychologists, what you called the cognitive psychologists' trilemma.
Right. These early scientists had three huge problems. First, how do you convert an unobservable internal mental process, like forming an association in memory, into observable behavior?
Okay.
Second, how do you measure that behavior reliably? And third, how do you systematically show that behavior is affected by controlled conditions?
And his elegant solution to that first problem was the method of nonsense syllables.
Exactly. He created these long lists of CVCs, consonant-vowel-consonant combinations like ZOK or VAM or BEJ,
Why those?
specifically to study the formation of new associations. By using these meaningless, relatively homogeneous materials, he minimized the interference of any pre-existing knowledge or emotional content. He was ensuring he was measuring the pure mechanics of rote learning.
His measurements then took this observable behavior and just quantified it. His first technique was simple: trials to criterion.
Yep. That just measured the time or the number of repetitions required for one perfect recitation of a list. And not surprisingly, longer lists required more repetitions.
Of course.
But Ebbinghaus plotted the precise, quantifiable relation, establishing memory capacity constraints mathematically for the first time.
But the real ingenuity, the move that really cemented his legacy, was his measure of retention through the savings method.
This is just a beautiful piece of experimental design.
Yeah.
Instead of simply testing what he could recall later,
Right.
Ebbinghaus measured the time or repetitions he needed to relearn the list to the same criterion at a later point.
And the difference was the key.
The reduction in trials needed, the percentage of trials saved, that quantified the retention. So if he took 20 trials to learn it the first time and only 10 the second time, he had 50% savings, even if he couldn't consciously remember a single syllable from the list.
And this is the philosophical punchline, isn't it? The savings method allowed him to measure retention even when he had absolutely no conscious memory of the items. By quantifying that savings, he devised an objective measure for the unconscious residue of memory.
It's profoundly important. Ebbinghaus was objectively demonstrating that learning persisted and had measurable effects on performance a full decade before Freud even began to popularize the concept of the unconscious mind.
Wow.
He took a concept that seemed purely subjective or philosophical, what remains after we forget, and made it quantifiable. He was paving the way for the study of implicit memory decades later.
His discoveries were so precise, and they're now just foundational knowledge. He found, for instance, a precise relation between repetition and retention.
Right, that 3 repetitions of a list saved him 1 repetition in relearning it a week later. It was that specific.
And most famously, he charted the shape of forgetting, discovering the logarithmic forgetting function.
Which dictates that the greatest amount of forgetting happens very quickly, almost immediately after learning. Then, the rate of forgetting slows down dramatically over time.
That's why cramming for an exam is such a bad idea.
It's the whole reason. That insight, which he actually fitted an equation to, is why reviewing material shortly after you learn it is so critical for long-term retention.
He also uncovered one of the most practical pieces of cognitive advice: the advantage of spaced versus massed practice.
Oh, yeah. He observed that 38 repetitions of a list distributed over 3 days had the same favorable effect on memory as 68 repetitions crammed into a single session the day before.
The same result, or even better, with almost half the effort.
Just by spacing it out. That single result is the foundation of every effective modern study schedule and educational strategy out there.
And to show the intellectual rigor he had, you just have to look at his work on remote associations.
Right. He wondered if associations formed only between adjacent syllables like A to B, B to C, or if the mind was also forming these weaker associations between remote ones like A to C or A to D.
How on earth did he test that?
With a very clever transfer of training design. He learned an original list, A, B, C, D, and then after forgetting it, he measured the savings when he tried to learn a derived list like A, C, E, G.
And he found savings.
He found savings. The fact that it was easier to learn the derived list confirmed the existence of these remote associations. William James even cited this as a classic example of competitive hypothesis testing. Ebbinghaus's legacy is really showing that even these complex, invisible mental processes can be studied systematically and objectively.
Okay, moving now from our internal memory systems to external sensory systems, let's look at echolocation.
A term coined by Donald Griffin in 1944. And this is just a brilliant example of perception adapted for a highly specific environment.
It's the use of actively transmitted acoustic signals and their reflections, their echoes, to locate objects, orient, and navigate.
We see it most famously in bats and marine mammals, especially dolphins. But some research shows that blind or blindfolded humans can actually achieve a limited form of it through training.
The system sounds simple on the surface, but the animals face these massive detection challenges just because they're operating in such acoustically noisy environments.
That's right. Echo detection depends heavily on the strength of the echo. So larger targets can be detected further away. But performance is so strongly influenced by the environment. Things like forward and backward masking, background noise, reverberation.
So sound bouncing off everything.
Everything. The signal processing needed to filter out all that background noise and just focus on the target echo is immense.
But the accuracy they achieve in localization is what really demonstrates the power of this biological specialization. They localize in 3 dimensions. Let's start with the horizontal position. Azimuth.
Azimuth is calculated using what are called interaural cues. The echo features, the intensity, the timing, the phase, they differ ever so slightly between the 2 ears depending on the sound's angle of arrival.
And the brain uses that tiny difference.
The bat's brain uses that tiny difference to permit the calculation, and it achieves an accuracy of approximately 1 degree.
That's incredible.
I mean, think about that. A difference in sound pressure measured across a head that's maybe an inch wide is used to pinpoint a target angle with almost perfect precision.
Okay, so what about the vertical position, or elevation?
Elevation relies on the specialized structure of the external ear, the para. As the echo travels into the ear, the regular asymmetrical shape of that external ear produces these subtle, spectral changes in the sound.
It's like an EQ filter.
It's exactly like an EQ filter. Some frequencies are amplified, others are dampened, and that pattern varies depending on whether the sound is coming from above or below. The bat's neural system uses these spectral changes to code elevation with an accuracy of about 3 degrees.
And the final dimension, distance or range, that's all about the time delay.
Yes, the time delay between the outgoing acoustic signal and the returning echo. And the precision required here is just staggering.
How precise are we talking?
FM bats can discriminate differences of about 1 centimeter in distance. That's equivalent to a tiny 60 microsecond delay. They can even register temporal jitter-minute timing variations of less than 1 microsecond. That's 0.1 millimeters.
Which you'd need to catch a fly.
Successful interception of a fast-moving insect requires 1 to 2 centimeters of accuracy. And dolphins show similar 1 centimeter discrimination capabilities.
It's incredible that they're not just localizing, but also performing this high-level perception, differentiating between targets. How does the sound processing discriminate between, say, a static dish and a fluttering insect?
Well, high-level perception studies show that FM bats can actually discriminate mealworms from discs.
Ow.
It suggests they're using complex echo features, likely based on slight differences in material composition or surface texture to determine the target's shape.
Wow.
And even more impressive, the greater horseshoe bat, which uses a specialized CFFM signal, is reported to recognize the fluttering of insects. It's using the Doppler shift caused by the wing movement.
So this all requires specialized auditory receivers for ultrasonic signals.
Absolutely. And it demonstrates how these advanced cognitive systems are built upon and exploit more fundamental auditory systems that evolve for simple hearing in less specialized animals.
Okay, let's pivot now to a fundamental philosophical shift in the study of perception that directly contrasts with that idea of the brain having to calculate reality. Let's talk about ecological psychology.
This is intrinsically linked to the work of James J. Gibson. And the ecological approach was a true revolution.
Why so?
Because it rejected the long-held central cognitivist assumption of the poverty of the stimulus.
Okay, what does that mean?
Traditional cognitive models assume that the sensory data we receive, the stimulus, is fragmentary, incomplete, and unreliable. Therefore, the brain has to rely heavily on internal mental representations, constructions, inference.
To basically build a coherent perception of reality from bad data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Gibson said that entire idea was fundamentally wrong.
He argued the opposite, right? That the environment itself is rich with information.
So rich. Especially the optic array. The structured ambient light that's reflected to a single point from all directions. Gibson's point was, you don't need to construct reality, because the information necessary to perceive depth, shape, and motion is already uniquely available for you to just pick up.
And it gets even richer when you move.
Crucially, the transformations in the optic array caused by an observer's motion are even richer, uniquely specifying the environment's layout and the observer's path.
Yeah.
We perceive information directly, not just fragmented sense data.
So if the environment is so rich, what is it that we are actually perceiving? It's not just abstract measurements like feet or meters, right?
Correct. The objects of perception are not absolute distance or size. They're the layout of the environment and, most importantly, affordances.
Affordances?
Affordances are the possibilities for effective action that the environment offers to an organism, and they're defined relative to the observer's own capabilities.
Give me an example.
A horizontal surface affords walking. A rock affords sitting. A sheer drop affords falling. Affordances inherently link the organism to its environment.
This sounds like the visual system isn't just the eyes and the cortex. The system itself must be much bigger.
It is. The ecological view focuses on the organism-environment system. The visual system includes this whole hierarchy of active organs. The eyes, the lens, the ocular muscles, the moving head, and the body itself.
So the brain is just one part of it.
Right. Specialized neural mechanisms, the brain, have often been of relatively little interest to ecological psychologists.
Yeah.
They argue that vision is equally impossible without both the brain and the richly informative optic array and the mobile organs that sample it.
And the research concepts that come from this view give us clear examples, like movement-produced information.
Yes, think of kinetic occlusion. This happens when objects systematically hide or reveal other objects as you move.
Like when you're walking past a fence.
Exactly. The visual elements of the surface texture are deleted at one edge and created at another. This kinetic process creates a compelling impression of relative depth and gives us this deep perceptual sense of object permanence, that an object can go out of sight without ceasing to exist. We rely on this information constantly.
We also look at modal invariance.
These are information structures available to multiple perceptual systems at the same time. For instance, the same shape information can be picked up through touch and through sight.
Feeling a shape and seeing it.
Exactly. Or, in these fascinating studies, people can accurately judge a lifted weight just by watching a point light display of someone lifting it. Infants show sensitivity to both tactile visual and audio-visual invariance very early on, suggesting the system is just designed to pick up these cross-modal structures.
The developmental work here is landmark, especially E.J. Gibson's visual cliff studies.
Those studies were instrumental. They showed that a baby's willingness to move onto a surface depended entirely on their perception of its affordances. The same depth layout might afford crawling, but not walking, based on the baby's motor development at that time.
So the big philosophical takeaway here is
that cognition is not about the mind copying reality or constructing it from sparse input. It's the process that keeps active, changing creatures in constant touch with an eventful changing world. It's about direct interaction.
this naturally leads us to a crucial methodological concept for cognitive researchers: ecological validity. If the environment is so critical, how do we study cognition without warping it?
That's the million-dollar question. Ecological validity refers to the extent to which behavior sampled in one context, typically the highly artificial, controlled, and brief laboratory setting, actually applies to an individual's cognitive processes in their diverse, complex, real-life environments.
It's a core concern for any researcher who wants to generalize their findings beyond the lab walls.
A huge concern. And it was famously articulated by Uri Bronfenbrenner back in 1979, who criticized the whole field for studying children in these unnatural, brief circumstances that bear no relation to the environments of their daily lives.
And the historical debate that frames this concept centers on the tension between two mid-20th century psychologists, Egon Brunswick and Kurt Lewin.
Right. Brunswick proposed that to achieve ecological validity, researchers must sample environments widely. He argued that situations or tasks, not people, should be the basic unit of psychological analysis.
How would that even work?
His method involved things like interrupting people frequently during their normal routine to have them estimate object sizes, measuring size constancy across all these varied real settings.
But Lewin disagreed strongly with that approach.
Very strongly. Lewin focused on the life space, the totality of the person and the psychological environment as it exists for him at a given moment in time.
So the subjective experience.
Exactly. He critiqued Brunswick, arguing that interrupting a subject to conduct a measurement fundamentally changes their life space. You're not capturing the real-life environment anymore. You're just importing laboratory constraints into a non-laboratory setting.
And Ulrich Neisser, in 1976, noted these marked discontinuities between real events and traditional laboratory events.
Neisser even suggested that researchers might sometimes deliberately create ecological invalidity by stripping away contextual information just to isolate specific, simple variables. But if the goal is to understand how the mind works in life, that's hugely problematic.
So Bronfenbrenner later formalized the criteria.
Right. Ecologically valid research must, 1, maintain the integrity of the real-life situation, 2, be faithful to the larger social and cultural context, and 3, be consistent with the participant's own definition of the situation.
So the crucial methodological difference boils down to observing tasks as they naturally occur in the wild versus just importing lab tasks into the wild.
Exactly. Lewin, Neisser, and Bronfenbrenner advocate for discovering and observing how tasks naturally occur. Brunswick, on the other hand, advocated making laboratory tasks happen in many different settings. The problem is the analytical burden.
What do you mean?
Laboratory experiments aim for closed analytic systems. They're controlled and predictable. But real-life behavior is an open behavioral system. And if you fail to accurately model that open, complex, interactive system, you will systematically misrepresent life processes. We have to be so careful that our methods don't fundamentally change the very phenomenon we're trying to understand.
Now we transition into a section where cognitive science directly challenges one of the longest-standing models of human behavior, economics.
Oh, yeah. For decades, economic theory operated under this set of highly idealized assumptions about individual behavior, all centered on the concept of homo economicus.
The perfectly rational agent.
The perfectly rational agent. They are assumed to maximize utility flawlessly, have clear and stable preferences, be perfectly selfish, ignore sunk costs.
Exploit every opportunity. They're basically good Bayesians.
Exactly. And they have to exhibit procedure invariance, meaning their preferences are stable across different ways of asking, and description invariance, where preferences are stable across logically equivalent descriptions.
But cognitive science, especially through the work of people like Kahneman and Tversky, showed that Homo sapiens systematically and predictably violates these assumptions. Let's start with how we perceive value.
Right. Contrary to maximizing final wealth, the psychological carriers of value for us are gains and losses relative to some subjective reference point. It's not the absolute final value that matters to us.
And that leads to these profound cognitive violations.
It does. For example, people exhibit risk aversion when they're dealing with potential gains. They prefer a sure, smaller gain over a chance at a larger one.
But they flip when it comes to losses.
They become risk-seeking when facing potential losses. They prefer a gamble over a sure, smaller loss. This attitude reversal, which occurs very predictably, is completely irrational under traditional economic theory.
And this feeds directly into the well-known framing effects.
Framing effects demonstrate that just the way a prospect is described, as a gain or as a loss relative to a reference point, triggers these opposing risk attitudes, leading to preferences that are just inconsistent.
So the classic medical example.
Exactly. If a treatment is framed as saving 200 lives, a gain frame, people are risk-averse. If it's framed as 400 people will die, a loss frame, people become risk-seeking. The outcomes are mathematically identical, but the psychological framing completely changes the decision.
And we can't talk about violations without discussing the incredible power of loss aversion and the endowment effect.
Loss aversion dictates that the loss of utility you feel from giving up a good is roughly 2 to 2.5 times greater than the utility you get from obtaining the same good.
We hate losing more than we like winning.
Much more. And this creates the endowment effect. Mere possession of an item leads us to value it higher than we would if we didn't own it. This translates to this general irrational reluctance to trade or depart from the status quo because the disadvantages of change loom so much larger than the potential advantages.
We also see violations in comparative judgments, like the preference reversal phenomenon.
In preference reversal, subjects will choose one lottery, often the safer, lower variance one over another. But then when you ask them to put a price on them, they'll price the lottery they didn't choose higher.
Specifically the one with the higher potential payoff.
Right. And this is a direct violation of procedure invariance. It shows that the weighting of an attribute, like the payoff magnitude, is enhanced by its compatibility with the required response. In this case, a monetary response. It even happens with experienced professional gamblers, showing how systematic this bias is.
And our internal representation of money itself is non-rational, violating the fundamental fungibility assumption.
The idea that money has no labels.
Yeah, that a dollar is a dollar is a dollar.
But we violate this constantly through mental accounting. People compartmentalize wealth into these distinct budget categories: rent, savings, entertainment, and separate mental accounts, current income, assets, future income.
Which leads to contradictory behavior.
Like saving money in a low-interest account while you're simultaneously carrying high-interest credit card debt. It also causes us to fail to ignore sunk costs because we've already allocated money from a certain account, so we feel we have to finish the project.
So the crucial tension here is that these aren't just random errors. They're systematic and predictable.
Exactly. And since the majority of people err in the same direction, these discrepancies won't just disappear in the aggregate or get ironed out by market forces.
So the goal isn't to say people are stupid.
Not at all. The goal is to develop a theory of economics populated with agents who are psychologically more realistic, replacing Homo economicus with Homo sapiens.
Speaking of psychologically realistic agents, let's see how cognitive science applies its findings to the learning environment with education.
Cognitive science in education has these two roles, descriptive and prescriptive. The descriptive research focuses on observing human learning, expert-novice comparisons, researching common student misconceptions, like in naive physics, where students believe a dropped object travels in an arc, not straight down, and studying skill acquisition and metacognition.
And the prescriptive element is about engineering better learning.
Right, from specialized reading modules to assessment-driven curricula. And this area is home to the ongoing situated cognition debate.
Right.
Proponents highlight that learning occurs within these narrow, context-specific situations, borrowing from ecological validity and distributed cognition. They emphasize naturalistic, apprentice-oriented cultural settings and often critique traditional, decontextualized, school-based learning as being ineffective.
But critics are skeptical, labeling it an unstructured, kind of unfalsifiable mix of ideas with vague prescriptions. What's the central dispute here?
The core dispute centers on the nature of symbols, and critically on the question of transfer of training.
Right. If learning is so tightly situated in one narrow context, how easily does that knowledge and skill transfer to solving problems in a totally different context?
Exactly. Critics argue situated cognition fails to provide robust evidence for broad transfer of skills.
Another major prescriptive application is the intelligent tutoring systems, ITSs.
Yeah, often based on computational models like John Anderson's ACT theory of cognition. These systems incorporate semantic networks and adaptive production systems to account for student data, predict outcomes, and serve as instructional bases.
And they can be really effective.
Superior ITSs show great effectiveness compared to standard classroom instruction. They can adapt the curriculum in real time to a student's struggles.
But the perennial challenge remains the same, doesn't it? Where is the intelligence or the semantics in this system?
It does. While they're effective, they still have limited interaction sophistication compared to a responsive, insightful human tutor. They are powerful demonstrations of how cognitive models can be engineered into practical learning tools, but they still represent a simplified model of human instructional interaction.
Now let's turn to the philosophical oversight of this whole process, epistemology and cognition.
Right. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge, how we know what we know, and cognitive science provides the evidence to evaluate our very own mental machinery.
And cognitive systems, including our memory and reasoning, are judged by three main criteria.
First, accuracy or verticality. Is it reliable? Does it have power? Second, conformity to formal standards. Does it follow deductive logic? Is it probabilistically coherent? And third, adaptiveness. Does it lead to goal attainment and survival?
If we apply this to memory, we immediately see the reliability problem. Memory is highly susceptible to post-event distortion.
Massively, especially when children are subjected to suggestive questioning. A third party, ethically, must distrust beliefs that are produced by processes known to be unreliable.
But we encounter a fascinating trade-off here.
We do, because reliable recollection requires source memory recalling how and where you encountered the information. But forgetting sources is often an economical response to the massive demands we place on our memory storage.
So if I forget where I learned that fact, that's an epistemic failure in terms of unreliability, but it's an adaptive success in terms of economy of storage.
Precisely. What looks like a failure according to the accuracy criterion might actually be rational according to the adaptiveness criterion. It just highlights the internal constraints on our cognitive machinery.
When we look at formal standards, like deductive reasoning, we find a significant debate about the nature of human competence.
That debate centers on whether our competence rests on abstract, domain-neutral rules like Rips argues, suggesting we have an innate mental logic, or if our reasoning is based on content-specific rules.
Rules derived from experience.
Either derived from experience, as Cheng and Holyoake argue, or, as evolutionary psychology suggests, derived from evolutionary pressures. For example, Kosmai's finding that people are highly specialized in reasoning about social exchange rules, specifically to detect cheating.
This feeds into the long-standing discussion about probabilistic reasoning and the famous heuristics and biases approach.
The dominant view is that people use mental shortcuts heuristics, like the representativeness heuristic, which leads to systematic violations of formal standards, like the notorious conjunction fallacy.
Right, rating the probability of A and B occurring together as higher than the probability of just B occurring alone.
Which is logically impossible. But the field has challenged the universality of these biases.
How so?
A major finding is that many of these cognitive biases disappear or are significantly reduced when tasks are presented in frequentist terms.
So using relative frequencies like 10 out of 100 people rather than single-case probabilities.
Exactly. This suggests people do possess an innate understanding of frequencies, which were evolutionarily relevant, but they struggle to apply universal probability theory to these single abstract cases.
So why does cognitive science matter so much to normative philosophy?
It matters intensely if you subscribe to reliabilism. That's the theory of justification that says a belief is justified only if it's produced by reliable cognitive processes that usually yield truths.
Okay.
If reliabilism is your standard, then cognitive science becomes essential for empirically determining which of our human mental processes, memory, induction, deduction, are actually reliable enough to produce what we can call knowledge.
And the final influential concept in cognitive architecture related to this is domain specificity.
This is probably the most influential modern approach. It posits that the mind is not one general-purpose processor, but a collection of independent subsystems or modules, each designed for a circumscribed task language processing, vision, or folk psychology, our innate theory of mind.
And this modularity is believed to constrain learning.
Right, which helps resolve the difficult problem of indeterminacy that's inherent in induction. It basically makes learning possible within the constraints of the environment.
We're now entering the deepest, most difficult territory in cognitive science, the philosophical knots that underpin the mind-body problem. We begin with a truly radical claim, eliminative materialism.
Yeah, this one is a mind-bender. Eliminativism asserts that certain mental states, particularly intentional states, beliefs, thoughts, desires, they simply do not exist.
So they're not just reducible to physical states, they're like phlogiston.
Exactly. They are posits of a flawed common sense theory, just as phlogiston was a mistaken posit in chemistry, or the caloric fluid theory of heat.
So the argument structure is clean, but pretty shocking. Premise 1, mental states are posits of a deeply flawed common sense theory called folk psychology.
Which is the way we explain behavior by saying, John believes X and desires Y.
Premise 2, folk psychology is seriously mistaken and fails to explain a lot of reality, like sleep, mental illness, learning.
And so the conclusion is, these mental states will not be part of the ontology of a mature cognitive science. Or, more bluntly, they just do not exist.
So to defend that second premise, eliminativists offer some powerful critiques.
One follows Wilfrid Sellars, known as the quasi-linguistic problem. Folk psychology implicitly assumes that thoughts are these quasi-linguistic sentence-like states in our head.
Okay.
If that's true, then non-human animals and pre-linguistic children must either lack beliefs entirely, or they must think in a non-public language of thought mentalese, an option many eliminativists find highly problematic, especially since neuroscience has yet to find any structured representations that map neatly onto these mental sentences.
And then there's the major challenge posed by connectionism, which models the mind more like a massive interconnected network.
Right. The connectionist challenge focuses on two related problems. First is holism. Folk psychology requires beliefs to be these contentful states that can be causally inert in some cognitive episodes.
So my belief about the capital of France isn't involved when I'm making coffee.
Exactly. But holistic connectionist models encode information such that virtually all information is causally implicated in every inference. They contain no such contentful, causally inert states, which violates the assumptions of folk psychology.
And the second connectionist challenge involves conceptual definition.
Yeah, conceptual modularity. Folk psychology assumes a single stable inner state for a concept. So the concept coffee should be represented by a single type of state, regardless of context.
But connectionist models don't do that.
No, they often represent concepts context-sensitively. The network representation of coffee when you're thinking about drinking coffee from a cup differs subtly but significantly from the representation of coffee when you're thinking about a bag of beans. This violates the required conceptual modularity, suggesting that beliefs, as folk psychology defines them, just might not exist in that kind of neural network structure.
Wow. Okay, so whether or not our thoughts exist, we intuitively feel that reality is structured in layers. That brings us to emergentism.
Emergentism is the claim that a property of a whole is not simply an additive resultant of, or a linear function of, the properties of its parts.
Like water.
The classic example. The property of wetness or liquidity is not present in the individual hydrogen and oxygen molecules. It emerges from their collective interaction. British emergentists historically claimed that emergence constitutes a new order of existence with special laws of behavior.
This contrasts sharply with the ideal of pure mechanism.
Which Broad defined as believing that all behavior is deducible from simple principles of composition, implying a high unity in science, that physics could, in principle, explain absolutely everything.
But emergentism implies less unity, viewing the world as a hierarchy.
And crucially, it requires two fundamentally different types of laws. Intraordinal laws, which operate within one level, like the laws of particle physics, and transordinal laws, which connect adjacent levels, like biology, to chemistry.
And these transordinal laws are considered irreducible facts.
Right. They cannot be deduced from the laws governing the lower level aggregate. They represent a genuinely new, non-predictable phenomena.
So, if consciousness is emergent, it means that no matter how perfectly you describe the physical workings of the brain, you couldn't logically deduce the existence of subjective experience from that description.
That's the core philosophical claim. Modern accounts link emergence to supervenience, the idea that mental properties are determined by physical properties, but they still insist on ontological irreducibility. The core debate is whether the laws linking conscious properties with physical properties are irreducible, emergent psychophysical laws.
Making consciousness an irreducible emergent property that can't be fully explained by physics alone.
Exactly.
Building on that, we encounter perhaps the most counterintuitive and shocking doctrine of them all, epiphenomenalism.
Epiphenomenalism is the claim that mental phenomena, conscious states, thoughts, feelings, are caused by physical phenomena, but they do not cause anything themselves.
They're causally inert.
Completely.
Yeah.
Mental states are effects, never causes. They're a conscious automatism, as Huxley called it.
The implication just violates our deepest intuition, that a belief causes an action or that a headache causes us to take aspirin.
Right. Under epiphenomenalism, the headache itself, the feeling, is merely a non-causal shadow of the brain activity that actually caused you to wince or to reach for the bottle.
That's a hard one to swallow.
It is. Epiphenomenalists argue that instances of a mental state, M, being followed by a physical state, P, is just a fallacy of association. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc.
Correlation is not causation.
Exactly. They claim M and P are dual non-interacting effects of a common underlying physical cause. And since physical causes are sufficient to explain all physical effects, a complete physical causal chain leaves no gap to be filled by mental occurrences. The mental is just along for the ride.
How do philosophers break down this concept of causal inertness?
They distinguish between two levels. Token epiphenomenalism is the strong claim that individual mental events, like this specific headache token right now, have no causal effects. The more subtle and common form is type epiphenomenalism, which asserts that events cause things in virtue of their physical types, not their mental types. The mental property itself is causally inert.
But this sounds very difficult to reconcile with the idea of multiple realization, where a mental type, like pain, can be physically realized differently in a human versus, say, an octopus.
It is a challenge. If a mental type like pain is multiply realized, and instances of that mental type produce a consistent effect regardless of the varied underlying physical realization, it really suggests that the mental type itself is causally relevant.
And despite all the philosophical maneuvers, the strongest intuitive case against epiphenomenalism remains the qualitative states, the qualia.
Absolutely. The raw feeling of an itch, the sharp ache of pain, the intuitive feeling that a headache must cause a bad mood is just so strong. Whether these qualitative aspects can be causally relevant remains a topic of intense debate.
Which brings us directly to the concept that formalizes this intuitive difficulty, the explanatory gap.
The explanatory gap states that even if mental states are physical, even if every conscious event is perfectly correlated with a neural event, we lack any explanation for the distinctive, subjective features of those states, the qualia, in terms of their physical properties.
We know that they happen, but not why they happen.
Right. We can describe the exact neural firings, the chemical cascades, the information encoding when someone sees blue, but the question always remains, why should neural firings look like that? Why should there be anything it is like at all to see blue, since non-conscious machines encode information just fine without any subjective experience?
The gap is highlighted by the conceivability argument.
The argument that adequate scientific explanations reveal a necessary relation. For example, the molecular structure of water necessitates that it boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit.
You can't have one without the other.
Right. But the physical account of vision doesn't seem to necessitate the subjective experience of redness. We can coherently conceive of the entire neural structure existing without the qualia.
And this is most powerfully illustrated by the Mary thought experiment.
Mary is the brilliant neuroscientist who lives in a black and white room and knows every single physical fact there is to know about color vision, every wavelength, every receptor firing, every cortical process.
She knows it all on paper.
All of it. The moment she leaves the room and sees a red rose for the first time, she learns what it looks like. The argument is that if she learned something new, the subjective experience, then the purely physical knowledge she had was incomplete.
Confirming the existence of a fact that eludes physical description and cementing the gap.
Exactly. And responses to closing this gap are really varied. Some suggest the gap just reflects limitations in our own cognitive capacities. We just can't form the right bridging concepts.
Others argue the gap is expected because of the peculiarities of first-person access.
Right. And of course, some, like the Churchlands, argue the gap will close with enough neurological detail. Or as Daniel Dennett claims, the concept of qualia itself is just confused and doesn't apply to real phenomena. But the point is, there is no consensus, and the gap remains the toughest challenge for materialists.
Our final philosophical knot to untangle here involves logic itself, extensionality and its failure when applied to psychological attitudes.
In classical logic, a sentence is extensional if replacing one component with a coextensive term always preserves the truth value of the sentence.
Coextensive terms being terms that refer to the exact same thing in the real world.
Right. So if the President of France and Macron are coextensive, replacing one with the other in the sentence, Macron lives in Paris, keeps the truth value the same.
But the moment we introduce thinking, believing, or desiring, what philosophers call propositional attitudes extensionality just breaks down.
Completely. Statements about psychological states are typically non-extensional. Let's use the car example. Say Stan's car is coextensive with the oldest Volvo in North Carolina.
Okay.
If we take the extensional sentence, Stan's car is a blue sedan, and replace the term, the truth value stays the same. But look at the non-extensional sentence. Hillis thinks that Stan's car is a new Jaguar. If we replace Stan's car with the oldest Volvo in North Carolina, the sentence becomes, Hillis thinks that the oldest Volvo in North Carolina is a new Jaguar.
And the truth value changes entirely because Hillis does not believe the Volvo is a Jaguar. He's ignorant of the coextension.
Exactly. The truth value of the sentence relies not on what the terms refer to in the real world, the extension, but on the subjective, intentional state of the person involved. The intentional content matters.
So the thesis of extensionality, TOE, which posits that every meaningful declarative sentence is equivalent to some extensional sentence, was a key goal of reductionists like Carnap.
Right, because it implied a vastly simpler and more intelligible universal language of science. But the failure of TOE in psychological context is profound. Philosopher Roderick Chisholm claimed that TOE is true for all non-psychological sentences, but false for psychological ones, supporting the inherent, irreducible distinctiveness of the intentionality of the mind from the rest of the physical world.
We shift now to our third major theme, the force that shaped all these systems, evolution. Let's start with the fundamental adaptive mechanism itself.
The simple idea is just that life has changed over time, with younger forms descending from older ones. But the developed conception, as systematized by Ernst Mayr, combines 5 main ideas.
Okay.
1, evolutionary change occurs. 2, it follows a branching pattern, the tree of life. 3, new species form via population isolation and divergence. 4, change is typically gradual. And 5, the primary adaptive mechanism is natural selection.
And the core problems for evolutionary biology, which Darwin's theory sought to solve, are explaining the vast diversity and clumping of life.
Why life clusters into distinct groups like arthropods and vertebrates.
And explaining sophisticated adaptation, the structured complexity and fine-tuned fit of organisms to their environments, like the highly specialized auditory systems used for echolocation we just discussed.
And natural selection is Darwin's genius solution. It requires just three things: variation in the population, fitness differences that result from that variation, and heritability of the traits that convey fitness.
So selection chooses the fitter organisms, and their offspring dominate the next generation.
And crucially, meteor adaptations result from cumulative selection, a long sequence of slight successive selective episodes over vast periods of time, not from a single massive mutation event.
This framework is foundational for understanding the mind, leading directly into evolutionary psychology, EP.
EP is the project of integrating functional specialization, primate studies, and formal evolutionary biology to map the entire species' typical computational architecture of humans, including our emotions and motivational mechanisms. It treats the mind as a system that can be reverse engineered.
And its guiding light is Williams's adaptationism, which imposes tight constraints on any functional claims.
That's right. Functional claims have to be tightly constrained and coupled to a design that leads to systematic gene propagation, specifically within the ancestral environment. So EP uses knowledge of that environment. For instance, the fact that eye direction reliably provided information about intentions to model the computational problems our ancestors regularly encountered. And this process of reverse engineering predicts candidate design features, like specialized eye direction detectors, which then guides empirical tests today.
This explains EP's strong stance on domain specificity, which we touched on earlier.
It does. EP is highly skeptical of architectures based predominantly on content-independent, general-purpose cognitive processes. The argument is that selection drives specialized computational devices modules because adaptive problems cluster into specific domains.
Face recognition, detecting cheaters, naive physics.
All of them. And efficiency and fitness demand specialization over general intelligence.
And EP claims this methodology is predictive, not just descriptive. They argue this is not simply post hoc storytelling.
Right. The field argues their model precedes and guides empirical discovery. They rely on thousands of confident facts about ancestral environments, that there were two sexes, that objects follow motion rules, that predation existed, that food was often shared.
Right.
And these facts can be deployed to design experiments, leading to discoveries about specialized reasoning for social exchange, female advantages in spatial location learning, likely for foraging, and why a frequency format enhances probabilistic reasoning.
And these adaptations, by definition, must be human universals.
Species typical, yes, allowing for cross-cultural triangulation of the design.
Finally, EP emphasizes partitioning traits.
We have to distinguish between adaptations, which are traits selected for fitness, byproducts, which are traits causally coupled to selected traits, like the redness of blood, and noise, which is just random perturbations. This framework is necessary to avoid labeling every single human trait as adaptive.
Next, we apply this framework to the ultimate cognitive puzzle, the evolution of language.
The research here begins by rejecting the idea that language is purely a cultural innovation learned from scratch every generation. Evidence from creolization, where children expand a rudimentary system into a full, syntactically rich language in a single generation, demonstrates that the capacity for language is internal and invented anew.
And the capacity isn't tied to general intelligence or even the vocal tract.
Correct. The capacity is dissociable from general intelligence. And it's also demonstrated by the proficiency of humans in sign languages, which confirms the capacity isn't exclusively tied to vocal production. All this evidence suggests the underlying capacity emerged through biological evolution.
So the central debate boils down to whether language was a specific adaptation or a useful byproduct of other evolutionary developments.
Selectionism argues that language shows classic signs of complex adaptive design, similar to the eye or the hand. It decomposes into these distinct, functionally specialized components like phonology and syntax. Therefore, it evolved as a dedicated biological adaptation specifically for communication.
And the other side.
The byproduct view claims that language ability is merely an enhanced shared capacity, a side effect of brain mechanisms that evolved for other purposes, like motor control, social cognition, or internal computation, which were then exploited with limited modification.
The complexity argument seems pretty compelling here.
It does. Darwin argued that natural selection is necessary only to explain organs of extreme perfection and complexity, and the immense structured complexity of language strongly suggests it falls into that adaptation category.
Moving from biological evolution to computational modeling, we look at evolutionary computation, EC.
EC refers to computational search, learning, and optimization methods that are loosely inspired by biological evolution. The three main historical methods are genetic algorithms, evolution strategies, and evolutionary programming.
It's essentially mimicking the simple brute force rules of evolution and heritable variation by a mutation and recombination, followed by selection of the fittest to search for complex solutions in these vast, high-dimensional problem spaces.
Exactly. The spaces that are just too large for simple linear solutions. Its cognitive relevance is crucial for AI and machine learning, but it's also deployed in evolutionary psychology to model the interactions between evolution and learning, and by social scientists to study the evolution of cooperation and communication in multi-agent systems, a field often called artificial life.
Next, we arrive at the origin story of much of this evolutionary behavioral thinking, ethology.
Ethology, defined by Lorenz, Tinbergen, and von Frisch, emphasized a Darwinian naturalistic approach to behavior. It was a necessary corrective to early behaviorism, which overemphasized external control. Ethology stressed endogeneity, internal forces, instinct, and the inherent rhythmicity of behavior.
They introduced the concept of the trigger, the sign stimuli, or social releasers.
Right, key components of a situation, often communicative signals that reliably trigger these innate release mechanisms in animals.
And while early ethology was sometimes criticized for presenting animals as overly pre-programmed, it led to the far more nuanced concept of canalized learning.
The idea that learning is catalyzed by innate predispositions, ensuring that development follows a predetermined, fitness-maximizing range of trajectories, like song learning in birds, which requires hearing the species' typical song during a sensitive period.
And the most famous practical application of this is imprinting.
Imprinting is that rapid learning and bonding process that occurs during sensitive periods, influenced by innate preferences for certain stimuli. This was hugely influential in psychiatry and social sciences, notably with Bowlby's attachment theory, and it provided a key heuristic framework for evolutionary psychology. This concept of instincts to learn really epitomizes the essential interplay of inheritance and experience in shaping behavior.
We have the architecture and the mechanisms. Let's look at the consequences for our moral life, ethics, and evolution.
This domain explores the idea of ethical nativism, the view that specific pre-wired mechanisms for ethical thought exist, supported by sociobiologists like E.O. Wilson. They argue that innate ethical beliefs, such as altruism, result from natural selection because they provided a selective advantage to early human groups.
The classic example being the argument that the belief or feeling that incest is wrong is innate.
Right, because it offers a selective advantage by helping avoid offspring with detrimental recessive genetic traits.
Now, the critical counterargument is the naturalistic fallacy,
which states that ethics is normative. It's about while biology is descriptive, it's about is. Just because evolution produced a trait, like aggression, does not mean we ought to act on it. T.H. Huxley, for example, argued that the ethical project requires combating biological evolution, not simply following it.
How does the nativist argument respond to this powerful critique?
The nativist counterargument suggests two things. First, that biology can define our constraints, limiting what we ought to do. And second, and more fundamentally, some philosophers argue that moral facts themselves are required to explain why certain beliefs were selectively advantageous.
That's a deep point.
It is. Just as mathematical facts are needed to explain the advantage of mathematical ability, moral facts might be needed to explain the selective advantage of moral beliefs, preventing the evolutionary account from undercutting moral realism.
Our next entry deals with how we categorize the world, essentialism.
Psychological essentialism is the folk theory, the common-sense way we structure our thinking. The category members possess an intrinsic, often non-obvious property, an essence, that determines their identity.
This is a claim about human reasoning patterns, not necessarily about metaphysics.
Exactly. And the sources detail three types of essences. There's sortal essence, the classical view of concepts. Then there's causal essence, the substance or process that causes other category-typical properties to emerge, like DNA for a species or H2O for water. Psychological research focuses heavily on this.
And the third type is ideal essence.
An abstract quality with no actual world instantiation, like Plato's form of goodness. Causal essentialism is incredibly important because it influences our inductive inferences and judgments of constancy. It allows us to believe that category membership is stable despite superficial changes.
And it's found in children very early.
As young as 2 or 3, suggesting that concepts aren't built atomically from perceptual features. Instead, we seem to look for these hidden, stable identities.
And the relevance of this is huge for scientific learning.
It is. Essentialist views, the belief that species are fixed and defined by an immutable inner essence, are one of the primary cognitive factors that impede the accurate learning of evolutionary theory, which relies on variation and change, not fixed identity.
And finally, under the evolutionary and cultural umbrella, we have ethnopsychology.
The comparative study of concepts of self, human nature, and motivation across cultures. And while people everywhere use psychological language, cultures vary wildly in conceptual elaboration.
They have terms for specific psychological states that have no direct translation.
Exactly. Terms like elongat or Japanese ame. However, there does appear to be a foundation of universality.
Okay.
Lexical studies of personality terms across cultures converge on 2 or 3 universal dimensions, especially solidarity and power. Emotion vocabularies also suggest a small number of basic universal effects, like anger and fear, tied to biologically invariant facial expressions.
And how do cultures structure these concepts?
Cultural models of emotion often form these complex narratives or event schemas. Metaphors like anger is heat play a central role in elaborating these cultural models. A narrative is just a general organizing principle. Our self-reports, our life stories are often intended to render experience in moral terms and to direct social interaction.
We wrap up our deep dive by looking at how cognitive science studies superior performance and how machines can learn more effectively, starting with expertise.
Expertise refers to the mechanisms underlying superior achievement, whether in professionals, artists, or athletes. And a crucial finding is the domain specificity of superiority.
Meaning experts' superior memory and performance is limited strictly to their domain.
Right. General measures, like IQ, don't distinguish the highest achievers in chess or music, which suggests that the differences reflect attributes acquired during lengthy, structured training.
This challenges the idea of general talent being sufficient, and it explains the plateau problem.
Yet performance improvement is not an automatic consequence of experience.
Yeah.
If you've been driving for 20 years, you're experienced, but you're likely no better than you were 5 years ago. Most people plateau.
So continued improvement requires deliberate practice.
Activities designed, often by a teacher or a coach, solely to improve specific aspects of performance. Top performers accumulate massive amounts of this deliberate practice, the famous 10,000 hours, though the exact time varies by domain.
So what's the qualitative cognitive difference between an expert and a novice?
It's not just automatic pattern recognition, as was sometimes suggested early on. Experts select information and encode it in special representations in working memory for planning and evaluation. Their knowledge organization is just qualitatively different.
And they effectively expand their processing power through specialized memory skills.
Yes, they acquire these domain-specific memory skills that rely on what's called long-term working memory, a mechanism that allows them to dramatically extend the accessible information during complex reasoning, essentially bypassing the limits of standard short-term memory.
Next, let's talk about the nature of explanation itself, a key philosophical and scientific goal.
Philosophically, explanation is about characterizing scientific understanding. The historical gold standard was the deductive nomological DN model.
Okay.
This model held that explanation is a deductive argument, deducing the fact to be explained from general, universal laws and observed facts. This works elegantly in mathematical physics and some AI systems.
But the DN model has significant limitations.
It fails for inductive or statistical explanations, like explaining why a patient contracted influenza, because the premise doesn't necessitate the conclusion. It also fails for historical sciences, like evolutionary biology, which explains retroactively and deals in contingent facts, not universal laws.
So alternative views suggest explanation is achieved by displaying causes and causal mechanisms.
Or by unifying diverse facts using common patterns. We also use functional explanation explaining a structure by how it contributes to system goals, like the heart exists to pump blood. And crucially, these functional explanations are entirely compatible with causal explanations, like natural selection.
And this leads directly to how AI systems can leverage existing knowledge to become more efficient. Our final entry is explanation-based learning, EBL.
EBL systems are designed to improve a problem solver's performance by making it solve similar problems more efficiently in the future. When the problem solver solves a problem, the EBL module explains the derivation structure, the logical steps that led to the solution, and then it collapses that structure into a new, single, higher-level rule called a macro operator.
So it's not learning new facts, it's learning shortcuts.
That's the key distinction from standard machine learning. Standard ML extends the deductive closure. It allows the system to solve new types of problems it couldn't solve before.
But EBL doesn't.
EBL performs a knowledge-preserving transformation. It does not extend the set of solvable problems. It only improves efficiency by transforming inefficient first principles knowledge into useful, fast expertise.
But I recall a significant catch here, the utility problem.
Right. Adding too many EBL-generated rules, especially if they're rarely applicable, can actually slow down the overall system because the problem solver spends too much time searching through its vast rule base.
So you have to manage the rules you create.
Exactly. The EBL module has to estimate the expected query distribution and evaluate the efficiency of adding the new rule. But successfully implemented systems have shown significant speedups, demonstrating EBL's power in converting theoretical knowledge into rapid, reusable expertise.
So here's where it gets really interesting. We've seen these 23 entries just weave together, confirming our initial suspicion that the world of cognitive science is defined by a few core recurring conflicts.
First, the enduring power of empiricism. From Ebbinghaus's rigorous objective methods allowing us to measure the unconscious residue of memory a century and a half ago, to the advanced measurements today that define the precise timing of selective attention in the brain, sometimes as early as 20 to 50 milliseconds post-stimulus, science is just relentlessly making the internal and unobservable measurable and quantifiable.
Second, the ecological imperative. The mind is fundamentally not an isolated processor. We learned that the environment is rich with information and possibilities for action. The affordances championed by ecological psychology.
And that true generalizable understanding requires acknowledging the complexity of the real world, the open behavioral system, and maintaining ecological validity in our research, rather than just isolating phenomena in a sterile lab.
And third, the evolutionary constraint.
Whether we were modeling economic decisions, revealing why Homo sapiens systematically violates the ideal of Homo economicus, or defining the specialized systems of the mind through evolutionary psychology, the shadow of evolution shapes what we can and cannot do, from our language capacity to our core moral intuitions.
So what does this all mean? The deepest ongoing conflict remains the mind-body problem. We hit this so hard in Section 4 with the explanatory gap. If Mary, the brilliant neuroscientist, knows all the physical facts about color, why does she learn something new the moment she sees red?
That thought experiment forces us to ask whether our current physical language, our reliance on objective descriptions and concepts of extensionality, where truth is defined by objective reference, are simply constitutionally incapable of capturing subjective first-person experience.
Where the mental, qua mental, cannot be ignored.
We are left asking, is the gap a failure of our current science? Or is it a failure of our current conceptual vocabulary?
We hope this deep dive into the foundational EASE files gives you a fresh, essential perspective on the complex, highly contentious, and just beautifully designed architecture of human cognition.
Thank you for diving deep with us.